Hey there, John Ferguson Smart here. I wanted to have a quick chat about test automation and test coverage. A lot of managers, from what I'm hearing, are still asking, have you got 100% test coverage? Or are we aiming for 100% coverage of our automated tests, whatever that means? Now, there are different levels of test automation that I want to explain so that you can talk to your manager about this. But the real thing to understand is, where is the manager coming from? The manager really just wants to know, are your features being released safely? Can you safely vouch for your features? Can you assure that you have automated coverage for the features that you are releasing? Now, the answer is, of course, no. You can't test everything. But before you get into that subtle philosophical debate with your manager, let's walk through what we mean by test automation and test coverage. Now, test coverage in itself, the core concept of test coverage is very simple. How many lines and branches in your code are executed when you run your tests? That's it. It's not a very good metric. It's not a very good way of measuring the quality of your test. I can give you 100% test coverage without testing a single feature in your application. That's very easy to gain. That's why saying to developers they need to write unit tests to achieve 100% test coverage is a very bad idea, because you will inevitably get superficial tests that don't actually test anything. I've seen thousands probably of them, of these tests that actually don't really do any tests, just go through the code. At best, they will check that there aren't any null pointer exceptions or crashes, but they don't actually check the real outcomes. From a developer perspective, the best way to get high coverage is not to aim for high coverage. The best way to get high test coverage metrics is to use TDD, test-driven development, to design your tests, to exercise examples of the code before you write the code, and then explore the edge cases incrementally as you go, and test more and more features as you develop them, as you branch out and explore the variations. Each time you write new code, there is a test for it, because that's how you define what your code wants to do. It's the fastest way I know to develop in the long term, by a long way. It's not that common. It should be much more common, because once you do it, it really is a no-brainer. But that's something developers do. It's not something testers would typically be that involved with. But that is where the core idea of test coverage comes from. But at that level, you're still not demonstrating have you actually tested the features you're supposed to deliver. I could do lots and lots of unit tests, but have I proved that my application does what the manager wants it to do? Who knows? The only way to do that is to phrase your tests in a way that works for the business, that expresses the requirements in the terms that the business understand. And that's what we have when we do in Agile. We have user stories with acceptance criteria. One user story will have many acceptance criteria. These acceptance criteria will define in business language what that story or what that feature should do. Now, if you can associate your automation with those acceptance criteria, if you can say, I have this story with 5 acceptance criteria, here are my acceptance tests, my automated acceptance tests, whatever form they are, Cucumber, JUnit, whatever, I have some automated tests that will prove that these acceptance criteria actually work. Now, that is a much more visible way of demonstrating test coverage than pure test coverage metrics. So that's what I call functional test coverage. And it will at least show that you've done your due diligence, that every acceptance criteria that you deliver has some automated tests that demonstrate that it does what it's meant to do. Of course, this doesn't exclude manual or exploratory testing. That's another issue. But it does give you a much higher degree of confidence and gives you something to talk about with your manager. If you can say, well, we're not going to achieve necessarily 100% of the line coverage, because there'll be always edge cases and variations that may not get covered. We will aim for all of our acceptance criteria. We want all of our acceptance criteria to have automation. That's a perfectly reasonable goal. But that brings us to another question. How do you define your acceptance criteria? How do you define the business rules that you need to illustrate in these user stories? Where do they come from? How do you make sure they are in business language? And that's where techniques like behavior-driven development are of huge value. But more on that in other videos. It's enough for today. Thanks for listening, folks.